and see what kind of layouts we have. So we're going to have a vertical layout. It's 1 and 2, so 2 rows. And then inside the second row, we're going to have a horizontal layout, which is 1 and 2. Now inside the second horizontal layout, we're going to have a vertical layout, 1, 2, and 3. So that's how we're going to break down this design. And again, don't worry about the video time here. We're going to recreate this later in the course. Let's go into our code and we're going to implement that. So make sure that we have our project open on the left here. And we're going to start by creating some vertical layouts. To create a vertical layout, we're going to create 2 divs. So this is going to be our vertical layout. Now remember that divs are block elements by default, so they're going to take up the entire line and appear one on top of another. And that's exactly what we want for a vertical layout. So let's look at our design here. We have the image in the first row, so I'm going to move this up, cut and paste. And then in the second row, we have everything else. So I'm going to put everything here in the second row. So cut and paste. Let's save it and refresh. Now we're going to create a horizontal layout down here. One column is going to have the channel profile picture and the other column is going to have the text. Let's create the channel profile picture first. We're going to create an image element. We're going to give it the source of the picture that we downloaded in the beginning. So that picture is in this folder. So we're going to go into this folder first, which is channel-pictures. And then remember to have a slash to go into that folder, and then channel1.jpg. Save it in this folder. So we're going to go in. So that picture is in this folder. So we're going to go into this folder first, which is channel-pictures. And then remember to have a slash to go into that folder, and then channel1.jpg. Save it. And now if we look at our current website, the image is actually in its own row. And that's because the channel1.jpg. Save it. And now if we look at our current website, the image is actually in its own row. And that's because the paragraph is a block element, so it has to appear on its own line. We're going to change this by creating a horizontal layout like 1 and 2. So to do that, we're going to create 2 divs. Here's one div, and here is another div. Now the difference here is that we're going to make these divs inline block elements. So remember that inline block is what allows elements to appear beside each other like this, while block elements force the element to take up the entire line, so they will appear vertically. So we're going to make these 2 divs inline block elements to create our horizontal layout. Let's reference our design first. In the first column, we have the channel profile picture. So I'm just going to move this into the first div here. And then in the second div, we have all the text. So I'm going to move all of the text here. Cut and paste. Now let's make these divs inline blocks so that they appear next to each other. I'm going to give a class so that we can target it with CSS. Let's call this the channel picture. And then we're also going to give a class to this div so that we can target it. Let's call this the video-info. And now in our CSS, we're going to make the channel picture display inline dash block. And we're also going to make the video info dash block picture display inline dash block. And we're also going to make the video info display inline blocks so they appear next to each other. Video dash info display inline block. Save it and refresh. Now you'll notice that they're still on top of each other, and that's because divs by default have a width of 100%. So we need to decrease the width of these 2 divs so that they appear next to each other. So remember that for the video preview card, so this whole thing, we set the div to 300 pixels, and that's how they can appear beside each other. So we're going to do the same thing for our horizontal layout down here. For the channel picture, let's set a width of 50 pixels. And then for the video info, we're going to set a width to 200 pixels. So this is the first column of our horizontal layout. It's going to take up 50 pixels like this. And then this is the second column. It's going to take up 200 pixels. It's going to appear beside the first column because both of them are display inline block. So let's save this. And you'll notice it looks really weird. So let's look at our code and see what the problem is. I'm going to scroll up here, and you'll notice that we set the width of the video title, which is this text, to 300. So we're forcing it to overflow here, and that's not what we want. So we just need to remove this and not force the width. So if we don't force a width of 300, the paragraph will just take up the entire space of the container, which is 200 pixels. Now, the second thing we notice is that this image is overflowing. And that's because images by default, they overflow. So they keep their original dimensions, so they keep their original size, and that causes them to overflow. So we want to resize, so they keep their original size, and that causes them to overflow. So we want to resize this image so that it only takes up 50 pixels. Let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's give it a class so that we can resize it. And I'm going to call this the profile-picture. And then I'll scroll up here, .profile-picture. And then I'm going to resize the width to 50 pixels. So that it fits exactly this column. I'm going to save it, and now that looks pretty good. We can actually see the layout in our browser by right-clicking Inspect and finding this HTML. So I can click this top left icon and just click this picture. So I'll show you what it looks like in the HTML. So here we have a vertical layout, so 1 and 2, and then here we have a horizontal layout, 1 and 2. Now a better way to do this is actually to set this to 100%. So this means the image will take up the entire space of its container. So if we look at our HTML, this image is inside this container. If we set it to 100%, it'll take up the space in the container, which is basically the 50 pixels that we have here. Let's save it. Next, remember that we've seen this problem before. They're not aligned. So we're going to align this inline block element to the top. To do that, we're going to use this property here, vertical align top, that we've seen before. So vertical dash align top. Save it. Alright, so we're almost there, but notice that these two aren't aligned. This paragraph has some margin at the top. Remember that paragraphs by default come with margin at the top and at the bottom. So we're going to go into our code and we're going to get rid of this margin at the top. So let's scroll up. Oh, so we actually deleted that style. So let's create a new style here. We're going to target the video-title. We're going to target the class video-title, set the margin -top to 0. And that's going to eliminate the space up here. So I'm going to pause here because we've actually created the nested layout that we need. Let's look into our HTML in the DevTools. And if we look at this video preview, we have a vertical layout 1 and 2. Inside the vertical layout, we have a horizontal layout 1 and 2. And then inside our horizontal layout, we have another vertical layout 1, 2, 3. So that's a practical example of using the nested layout technique to create a layout that's a similar shape to this. The only thing that's left to do is to style our website with CSS one by one until it looks like this. So we're going to do that right now. So let's go into our code and we're going to style these elements one by one. So I'm actually going to move this down here so that I can see it a lot easier. So the first thing I notice is that the image is round. So remember, to create a round image or round anything, we're going to use rounded corners. So we're going to set the border dash radius to, let's say, 20 pixels. Save it. Okay, so we have rounded corners and it's getting more round, but it's not a full circle yet. So let's set this to maybe 50 pixels. Okay, so now it looks a little too big. Let's set the width to something like 40 pixels. I think that looks pretty close, and we can always change it later. Next, there's some spacing between the first row and the second row. So let's go in here. We're going to set a class here. Call this the thumbnail dash row. And then we're going to style this thumbnail row, and remember to add spacing to the bottom. We add margin dash bottom, and let's add a margin of maybe 10 pixels. Save it. Okay, maybe 12 pixels. Okay, so that looks good enough. And finally, we can style the text. So this YouTube project is actually using the Google font called Roboto. We learned in a previous lesson how to load Google fonts, and in particular how to load Roboto. So we're going to do that again. Let's go to a new tab. We're going to search for Google Fonts. And we're going to load Roboto onto our page. So if you don't have this here, this is from my previous session. We can actually search for Roboto and then just open it here. And then we select the styles that we want. So I'm going to get the regular style. And then this seems like a bolded font. So I'm going to get the medium font and the bold font just in case. So I'm going to go up to see the styles I selected. And then that looks pretty good. And Google will give me the code that I need to load this onto my website. I'm going to copy this and just paste it into my head. So right in between here. All right. So now I loaded the Roboto font and we're going to use it in our page. So we're going to target all paragraphs. And we're going to change their font family to Roboto. And we're also going to use a backup font with this comma of Arial. So this syntax here with a comma is called a font stack. This basically lets us set up a backup font. If for whatever reason Roboto fails to load from Google, then it will fall back to our backup font, which is Arial. Let's save it. Next, I'm going to change the size of the font. So let's change the video title. to maybe 14 pixels. Save it. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Next, I'm going to make it bold. So font-weight bold, save it. So this looks like it's a little bit too bold compared to this font. So I'm actually going to change this value to 500. So if you recall, we actually selected 3 styles of fonts: the regular 400, medium 500, and bold 700. So when we set the font weight to bold, it actually corresponds to a number, which is 700. A regular font weight is 400, and a semi-bold is 500. So usually we use the number value because it's a little more precise. So usually instead of typing font weight bold, we would use font weight 700. In our case, our font is a little too bold, so we're going to decrease this to 500, which is the medium size that we picked on Google Fonts. So let's save this. And that looks pretty close. Next, we're going to change the space between the lines. So remember, the property to do that is called line-height. And let's try 14 pixels. That's not enough. Maybe 20 pixels. All right, so I think that looks pretty good and close to our design. You might notice that the text here is shorter than what we have in the design. You may or may not see this because this text actually depends on the size of the web page. So depending on how wide your web page is, the length of this text will change. And in our current website, we actually haven't implemented this resizing. So we are going to fix this later. Next, I'm going to style this paragraph. So let's go into our HTML here and look at the class name. So it's the video author. And it looks like we don't have any styles for that yet. So I'm going to write it down here. So we're going to style the class video-author. The first thing I notice is the font size. So it's a lot smaller. So font-size. Let's try 12 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so I think that looks pretty close. And we're going to change the color. Color. Now remember, to get an exact color, we can right click, inspect, and then click this top left icon, click this text, go to the computed tab, and if we scroll down, we should get the text color right here. So RGB 96, 96, 96. So save that. And if we go back, okay, that looks perfect. Next, I'm going to style this paragraph. So in our code, this paragraph is called video-stats. And I'm not sure if we have a style for this. Doesn't look like we do. So I'm going to write a new one. So dot video-stats. We're going to set the font size to 12 pixels because these two look the same. Okay, and then we're going to set the color as well, since these two look the same. And now remember that whenever we have these duplicate styles like this and this, we can actually target multiple classes by adding a comma. So we're going to target the video-author class as well as the video-stats class. So this is going to help us reduce duplication of our code. So I'm going to delete these lines. Save it. Everything looks okay. And the last thing we're going to modify is the spacing between the paragraphs. So remember that paragraphs by default come with margin at the top and at the bottom. Now, instead of removing them individually, I'm actually going to go up to the top of our page. So we did this once before. We're going to get rid of the default margin for all paragraphs on the page. So to do that, we're going to go into these styles and we're going to set the margin-top to 0. Margin for that paragraphs by default come with margin at the top and at the bottom. Now, instead of removing them individually, I'm actually going to go up to the top of our page. So we did this once before. We're going to get rid of the default margin for all paragraphs on the page. So to do that, we're going to go into these styles and we're going to set the margin dash top to 0. And we're also going to set the margin dash bottom to 0. And this will get rid of all the default margins. Save it. And now we can set a more precise margin at the bottom here. So under the video title, let's set a margin bottom of maybe 15 pixels. Margin at the bottom here. So under the video title, let's set a margin save it. And now we can set a more precise margin at the bottom here. So under the video title, let's set a margin bottom of maybe 15 pixels. Save it. Okay, looks like it's a little too much, maybe 12 pixels. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. And now under the video author, we're going to add some margin. So currently we have some styles that apply to both of these. I'm going to target .video-author individually down here. So for the video author, I'm going to add a margin dash bottom of maybe 6 pixels. Save it. And maybe 4 pixels. Okay, so I think that looks pretty close. And now if we look at our website, you can tell that it's actually really close to the final design that we have. Now to finish off this second video preview, you have a choice. You can either do everything that we did in the code here to give yourself more practice, or if you want to save time and move on to the next section, we can just copy all of this HTML and replace this part here. And then just swap out the thumbnail as well as the channel profile picture, which you will need to download first from here, as well as swap out all of the text. So I'm just going to fast forward this video to finish up this section. Second video preview, but feel free to pause it and try it yourself to give yourself more practice. And there we go. In this lesson, we learned the nested layouts technique, which is one of the most important techniques for being able to break down a design that you see on a website and recreate it using code. In this lesson, we're going to learn about CSS Grid, which is a much better way to create these horizontal layouts, as well as to create a grid like this that you see in our final project. First, we're going to open up the website we were working on. So I have it open right here. And remember that for our horizontal layouts, we were creating them using something called display. In this lesson, we're going to learn about CSS Grid, which is a much better way to create these horizontal layouts, as well as to create a grid like this that you see in our final project. First, we're going to open up the website we were working on. So I have it open right here. And remember that for our horizontal layouts, we were creating them using something called display inline block. So if we go into our code and we scroll down, we were using display inline block and a width to put these two side by side. Now there are some problems with display inline block that I want to show you right now. we're going to set the background color of these to gray. So this will make it easier to see what the problem is. Now let's save it. And now you can see that there's a little bit of space between these two. And this causes some alignment problems. So the width of this entire container here, the width here, we set it to 300 pixels. But we set the channel picture to 50 pixels here, and the video info to 200. So you would expect that we can actually set this to 250 to take up the entire 300 pixels. But if I save it, you can see that it's too long and it wraps to the next line. So we have to set it to something like 245. And that will cause it to appear beside each other. So this is one problem with inline block, is that it has some alignment problems. Now you might be wondering where this space is coming from. If we scroll down to our HTML, we can see that there's actually some space between these two divs. And we learned earlier that HTML combines multiple spaces together, and that's what shows up here. So we could remove this and save and get rid of that space, but that means our code is less easy to read. Now the second problem that inline block has is that it's not vertically aligned like you see here. So now we're going to learn a new technique called CSS grid that's going to help us create perfectly aligned horizontal layouts. To learn grid, we're going to create a new file where we're just going to practice using grids. So let's go into our code editor, and we're going to create a new file called grid.html. And remember, for every HTML file, we want the proper structure. So at the top, we're going to have a doc type. And then we're going to have an HTML element. And then inside, we're going to have a head element and a body element. Now that we have the proper structure, we can open this file in Live Server. So let's right click and open with Live Server. And then let's set the title or the text in the tabs here to grid practice. So we know what this file is about. Let's save it. So I'm going to resize my windows here just so we can see what's going on. We're going to start off in the body, and we're going to create a div. And then inside this div, we're going to create two divs. So let's call this div 1, and let's call this div 2. Save it. And now to help us learn, I'm actually going to show you a new way of writing CSS. So if we go to the opening tag here, we can set a special attribute called a style attribute. Now the style attribute is unique because it lets us write CSS code inside. So let's write the code background-color light blue. And we save it. We can see that the styles that we wrote here are applied to this element. CSS called inline styles. We're writing our CSS inside a line of HTML. We've already learned two other ways of writing CSS. One of them is the style element, and the other is to put our CSS in a separate file. This is a third way of writing CSS. Now, generally, we don't use this in real websites because it makes our HTML harder to read. In real websites, we put our styles in a separate file. But for now, since we're learning, this is pretty useful because number one, it only affects the element with the style attribute. And the other thing is that the CSS code is right beside our HTML, so that when you go and review this file later, it's very easy to see what's going on. So let's practice with the style attribute. We're going to add another one to this second div. So let's set the style to background color. And we'll set a background color of light pink. Let's save it. And now we have the two divs we're going to work with. Now currently we just have two divs inside another div. There's nothing new going on here. But now we're going to create our first grid. So what is a grid? A grid is a layout that has rows and columns. For example, this is a 2x3 grid. We have 2 rows and 3 columns. This is a 1x2 grid. We have 1 row and 2 columns. So we're going to learn how to make this kind of structure in our HTML. To do that, we're going to style this outer div or the container. So let's see how that works. We're going to set a style attribute here. And to create a grid, we're going to need 2 steps. The first step is to set the display property. And we're going to set display to grid. The second step is we need to set how many columns our grid has. So to do that, we're going to use this property, grid-template-columns. And we're going to give this property 2 values, 100 pixels and 100 pixels. So these 2 values define how wide our grid columns are. The first column is going to have a width of 100 pixels, and the second column is going to have a width of 100 pixels as well, and our grid will have 2 columns. So if we save this, you'll see that we created our first 1x2 grid. Now I want to point out a few characteristics of a grid. First of all, notice that this div is no longer taking up the entire line. So recall that divs are display block by default. They're supposed to take up the entire line. But when this element is inside a grid, it's actually placed into the grid. So it only takes up the entire column instead. The second thing you'll notice is that there's no extra space between these two, unlike with display inline block. And the third thing to notice is that, for example, let's add another element into the second div. Let's add a paragraph of text. Save it. When we add more elements, this makes the second div taller than the first one, but they are vertically aligned. And that's another difference between grids and display inline block. Grids maintain alignment much better. Alright, so that is our basic grid. Now we're going to create another grid to practice with. We're going to go into our code. We're going to copy all of this. And then we're going to paste it below. And it's a little bit weird, the formatting, so we can select this and press tab. to move it back into a normal position. Let's save it. And now we have our second grid, but let's actually add some space to the top so that we can see it more clearly. We're going to add some margin dash top. Of 30 pixels. Save it. Okay, that looks pretty good. And this time we're going to add a third column. So this property actually takes any number of values that you give it. So if we add a third value here of 200 pixels, it's going to create a third column that is 200 pixels wide. So the number of values determine the number of columns, and the value itself determines the width of the column. So if we save it, we do have 3 columns here, but we only have 2 divs. So we need another div to fill out the third column. To do that, let's copy our first div, and then we're just going to paste it down here and call it div 3. So now we have 3 divs to fill out the 3 columns, and you can see that our third column is 200 pixels versus 100 pixels that we saw right here. So let's actually change the text here so that we can see what's going on. So 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and 200 pixels. Save it. So now let's see what happens when we add another div to our grid here. So let's copy this second div and then duplicate it. So copy it and paste. You can actually get rid of this paragraph here. So create. So let's, for the second one, we're going to change it to 1FR. So FR is a special value in grid that stands for free space. It means to take up the remaining amount of space on this grid. So if I save it, you can see that the first column here is 100 pixels, and the second column has a width of 1FR, so it takes up the remaining amount of space that we have. If I resize the page, it'll take up the remaining amount of space. So that's what 1FR means. I'm going to change this to 1FR so that it's easier to see when we review this file. So this FR value is exactly what we need in our final design. If I open my final design, you can see that we have a horizontal layout here. The first column is about 50 pixels, and we want the second column to take up the remaining amount of space, which is exactly what we need 1FR for. Now before we go and update our project, I'm going to show you another property of this FR value. Let's copy this div and create another grid below it. And this time, we're going to add a third column that is also 1FR. And we're going to add another div to fill out this third column. Let's copy this and paste it into a third div. This one is also going to be 1FR. So let's save it here. And for this example, the second column and the third column both have 1FR. So 1FR tells the columns to take up the remaining amount of space, and the number in front of it tells us relatively how much of the remaining space this column gets. Since in this example, both of them are 1, they'll get an equal amount of the remaining space. So here, these two are equal and they take up the remaining space. If we change the third column to 2FR, so let's change this to 2FR and save. The second and third column will take up the remaining space, but the third column will be twice as wide as the second column. So this number here is sort of like a ratio. This second column will have 1/3 of the remaining space, and this third column will have 2/3 of the remaining space. Now that we understand that concept, we're going to go back into our project and use grids to create this horizontal layout instead of inline block. Let's go to our code And we're going to scroll down into the HTML for this, which is right here. And I'm going to collapse it so it's easier to see. We have the channel picture and the video info, which is these two. So to create a grid, remember we need to create it on the container, which is this div. So let's set a class name of video-info-grid, and then we'll target this class in our CSS above. I'm going to scroll up, and I'm going to actually put it right here. Video-info-grid, because this is right above the channel picture and the class name of video-info-picture and the video info, which is these two. Create this horizontal layout instead of inline block. Let's go to our code, and we're going to scroll down into the HTML for this, which is right here. And I'm going to collapse it so it's easier to see. We have the channel picture and the video info, which is these two. So to create a grid, remember we need to create it on the container, which is this div. So let's set a class name of video-info-grid, and then we'll target this. This class in our CSS, because this is steps grid. Want these one in the inline blocks is gone, so unlike here. And you'll also notice that these two are vertically aligned. So now that we have our grid, we can actually remove all of these inline block styles because we're not using them anymore. So we can actually remove all of these and all of these. Let's save it. And now let's set a grid for the second video preview. We're going to scroll down. So remember, we're going to set the styles on the container here. Video, then all -info-grid, save it, and then all the styles that we wrote up here to set a class of video-info-grid, save it, and then all the styles that we wrote up here will target that is perfect about grid, a bigger grid like this. Let's between size the browser so that we see 3 videos, and this will make sure that everyone can follow along. So I'm going to zoom back in and just make sure I have 3 videos in each row, and we're going to learn how to create this kind of layout. Let's go into our grid practice file, and we'll go back into our code again and to our grid.html file, and we're going to create another grid to practice with. So let's copy this and then just paste it down here. And now for this example, let's look at our final design. We essentially want 3 columns of equal size. And when we resize the page, notice that the columns resize as well. So notice that if I resize too much, it becomes 2 columns. We're going to deal with this later in the course. We're not going to deal with that. We're just going to deal with 3 columns that we have here. So for this layout, we want something like 1FR, 1FR, and 1FR to divide the space evenly. Let's go into our file here and with the here, what's going on, we're going to be working with. Let's also set the height so that it looks a little bit like our video previews that we have here. So let's go into our HTML file and we're going to set the height to 200 pixels. And let's also save it. Okay, so that looks pretty good, but they're a little bit too much at the bottom of the page. We're going to add some spacing at the bottom of the website so that we can scroll these up. Let's go back up into our HTML and we're going to scroll up to the body tag. We're actually going to add some spacing inside the bottom of the body tag. So remember that spacing on the inside is called padding. So padding dash bottom, and let's set it to something like 1000 pixels. So it's a lot easier for us to practice. So now that we have a lot of space at the bottom, we can scroll all the way up and see our grid clearly. So remember that in a grid, if we have more elements than we have columns, it'll start wrapping around to the second row. So all we have to do is add 3 more divs. So we're just going to, let's actually copy the pink one first. Let's copy it and paste it. And then we'll add a blue and a pink at the bottom. Let's copy and paste it. So we just need 6 divs to work with that have alternating colors like this. So let's save it. And now we essentially have our video preview that we see here. And we're going to learn how to create the space between the columns and the rows. So it's actually really easy to create this space. We just need 2 CSS properties. The first one is called column-gap. So it's pretty straightforward what this means. We're setting some space or a gap between the columns. So let's set a column gap of 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it. And now all of our columns have a gap, just like our final design here. Next, we're going to set the space between the rows. And we have a similar and straightforward property for that called row-gap. And let's set this to something like 40 pixels. Save it. And now we have space between the rows, just like our final design. So that's how we create a grid like this. First, we define with them. Then we just add some space between the columns using column gap, and we're going to apply down so we can organize them. First of all, let's just create 6 of these video previews so we can organize them. And we're just going to make duplicates. So copy it and 2 more. So paste it again. Grid, we need a container. So we need a container for all of these video previews. So let's create a div, and this is going to be our container. We're going to call this the video-grid. And now let's move all of these video previews. Previews inside our new grid. Just going to move all of them. Cut it and paste it in here. And so let's go -grid, grid, that far. Now if we So the reason this happens is because if we go and scroll up, we set a width on the video preview, which sort of forces the width to be 300 pixels. And earlier we also set the width of the thumbnail to 300. So instead of setting the width like this, which will force the width, we actually just want these elements to take up all the space in the columns that they're inside of. So to do that, we can remove this property here. And let's save it. And for images, a weird behavior is that they always keep their original size. To get them to fit inside their container or inside the column of the grid, we have to set a width of 100%. Save it, and now they will only take up 100% of their container. Now we also don't need the display block here anymore. So this image is taking up 100%. It's already on its own line, so display block is not necessary. So let's delete that. And now we're going to deal with this video preview width. For this, we can just get rid of the width here, block, column gap property we learned earlier. So let's just get rid of all of these styles. And now if we save, we can now see that our video previews are fitting perfectly inside of our grid. The final step is we're going to add some space to the columns and to the rows. So Let's go into our CSS here. And remember the two properties, they're pretty straightforward, are column-gap. And let's set a column gap of maybe 15 pixels. Save it. Okay, let's compare that to our design. And I'm going to resize it a little bit. So I think this looks pretty close to what we have. Maybe 16 pixels. Okay, and then we're going to set a row gap. Let's set a row-gap of maybe 40. Save it and compare it to our design. So I think that looks pretty close to what we have. Now the design might look a little bit smaller, and that's because we have the sidebar here, but we're going to deal with that in a later lesson. So for now, this looks perfect. The last thing we're going to do, save it, and okay, and then we're going to set a row gap. Let's set a row-gap of maybe 40. Save it and compare it to our design. So I think that looks pretty close to what we have. Now the design might look a little bit smaller, and that's because we have the sidebar here, but we're going to deal with that in. So I think that looks pretty close to what we have. Now the design might look a little bit smaller, and that's because we have the sidebar here, but we're going to deal with that in of maybe 40. Save it and compare it to our design. So I think that looks pretty close to what we have. Now the design might look a little bit smaller, and that's because we have the sidebar here, but we're going to deal with that in a later lesson. So for now, this looks perfect. The last thing we're going to do is to swap out the thumbnails, the channel profile pictures, as well as the rest of the text to match our design and the channel profile picture first. For now, let's just do 6 of these videos, and then we can add the rest of them at the end of the course. And the text. And I'll see you back after looks like after I swapped everything out. So that's the end of this lesson. We learned about CSS Grid, which is a great way to create these horizontal layouts with grids. We're going to learn about Flexbox, which is another way to create layouts. And we're going to use Flexbox to create the header at the top of the page. So Flexbox is similar to CSS Grid. It can create the same kind of layouts, but it's more flexible. Just like the previous lesson, let's go into our code and create a new file just to practice Flexbox. We're going to create a new file by clicking this icon, and let's call it flexbox.html. And remember, we always start with the HTML structure. We're going to have a doc. And over this lesson, we're also going to compare Flexbox to Grid to show what the similarities and differences are. So we're also going to, let's call this Flexbox practice and then save. So this is just going to remind us that this file is for Flexbox practice. It's going to show up here. Next, we're going to go into the body and start creating some Flexboxes. So just like for Grid, we're going to create a div, and inside we're going to have 2 divs. So div 1 and div 2. So we're going to use inline CSS again, just like we did for Grid, like here, so that we keep our CSS code close to our HTML code, and it'll be easier to understand what's going on when we review this file in the future. So inside our div, let's set a style. And for this div, we're going to set the background color to light blue like before.